Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, if you missed the stream, we did it. And I do mean we. 200,000 subscribers. I am grateful. Thank you guys so much. I continue to be blown away by the growth of this channel, and I do not take the credit for that. It's this incredible community. As I mentioned in the stream, I often get comments from people who are new to the channel who observe just how great our community is as they read through the comments, how civil everyone is, how kind everyone is. That's exactly what we're after. I occasionally have to weed out some comments here and there that I delete that aren't very kind, but it's very, very rare. And none of our regular folks who are a part of this community. So thank you for that. Welcome if you're new. And I hope you enjoy what you find. I am actually recording this a day ahead of time because I will be all day speaking at a school in Avon, Ohio. Excited to be spending the day with a group of students in kindergarten through 8th grade talking about kindness. And I'm also going to have about a 5-hour break between events that I'm doing in Avon. So I might try to find some northwestern Ohio areas that I might be able to make a little content for the channel. So we'll see what I can find in a few short hours that I've got. But let's go ahead and dive into part 3 of Vlad the Impaler. Thank you to everyone who responded yesterday to the video, letting me know that yes, Vlad Tepish, which is the nickname that he has, that loosely translated as Impaler. So that's just Romanian for Vlad the Impaler. So let's go ahead and take a look at part 3.
Targovishta, Easter, 1457. The Wallachian boyars are feasting at Vlad Dracula's table. In their fine Easter clothes, they raise toasts to their new prince. The past, they say, is forgotten. But Vlad does not forget. Suddenly, there's a commotion, and soldiers begin grabbing their arms. Vlad then separates the boyars and their families who had risen against his father and buried his brother alive, marching them out into the spring cold. The oldest are immediately impaled, while the others are force-marched down to a town below a ruined mountain fortress and told to pick up the freshly made bricks there.
So, as we talk about Vlad the Impaler, understand that they haven't gotten into that detail on these videos, but he wasn't impaling dead bodies. It wasn't like these were people who were killed in battle and then impaled afterwards as a warning to people. Now, these people were very much alive when they were placed on these sticks, and the sticks were typically put through the most obvious area of the person, as you can expect, and then it would come up through them, and they would very slowly and very painfully die while impaled. It was a twist on the whole idea of crucifixion. It was a terrible way to die. So it was more than just a warning to other people. It was also a very excruciating way to put to death your enemies.
They will carry the bricks up the mountain, rebuilding Vlad's new castle for the rest of their short lives. Their fine clothes tearing and falling away until they're nearly naked, and most work until they collapse and die. But who cares if the boyars perish from frostbite and exhaustion, huh? Vlad is the prince, and he can appoint new nobles. Thanks so much to HelloFresh for helping bring history to the table. Now, if you watched our last 2 episodes and thought, I thought this guy was called Vlad the Impaler, but he's hardly impaled anyone.
Oh, it's
Bring
coming.
on the impaling! After this episode, you might regret that ask.
Yeah.
Because this part of the tale contains like a bajillion% more impalings and violence. Seriously, it's a lot. So please let this serve as a content warning for everything that follows, because this one's going to get brutal. But before we go there, I want to take a slight detour and talk about state violence during this era, since it's important to understanding Vlad, his times, and how he's remembered.
And this is important any time in history. It's not that one has to justify a person's behavior, but it is always important to view it in the context of the times in which they live. View the decisions that they make in that context. Decisions that they make then that we would never think to make today are motivated by things that we don't have to consider today. And so while we're not justifying behavior, decisions, actions, choices, we need to understand them in context.
The 15th century was a particularly bloody time in Europe, one where violence was commonplace in everyday life. Few laws governed warfare, and rebellions often ended with massacres or mass executions. and it was common all over Europe to keep populations in line with displays of extreme violence, as this was an era of gory public executions and torture.
It's not like this was only happening in Eastern Europe. It was happening in Asia. It was happening in Britain. It was happening in North America between Native American tribes. It was common everywhere.
English kings put heads on spikes. French ones broke people on the wheel. And the Spanish had the Inquisition. In other words, public displays of cruelty were a form of political communication.
Yep.
We say this not to excuse Vlad. Actually, if anything, it does the opposite. Because even by these standards, his campaigns of violence were considered extreme. While we don't have a lot of primary source documents on Vlad, and things written about him or preserved orally are likely exaggerated, there is a clear theme that emerges.
And that's also something, and I've talked a little bit about this already, when we're talking about history. Number one, the closer to the event that things are written, the better, as I mentioned before, because primary sources are, when they're closer, they're not writing through generations of hearsay and legend that builds up around things. But it's also important to keep in mind who's writing. Who's writing this and what is their motivation? So, for example, when we're talking about the Wars of the Roses in England, when we're looking at the fact that it's the Tudors, historians who are writing things down, they're going to have a very particular bias against the Plantagenets, for example, against people like Richard III. They're going to want to sell him as a tyrant, as an evil child murderer, because it helps make them look better for overthrowing him. So consider how close to the events are the sources and who are the sources whenever you're looking at history.
When we look at his second reign, when he gained the throne in 1457, Vlad embarked on a planned, deliberate campaign to break the power of the boyars, which had been on the rise since the time of his grandfather. In fact, the instability of the Wallachian throne was not all due to outside interventions by Hungary and the Ottomans. It had as much, if not more, to do with the Wallachian boyars, who always tried to steer the weakest candidate to the throne and increase the power of their own council.
So in addition to Hungary and the Ottoman Empire from without trying to influence who's on the throne, you also have powers from within trying to influence on the throne. Hungary and Ottomans, they want somebody who's going to be pro their side, just like these nobles do. These nobles want somebody who's pliable and who can be influenced and who can be kind of forced into things. So there's all these different, things at play here, people trying to control. And if you're the person on the throne, you're in the middle of all of it.
Vlad, on the other hand, tended toward the aristocratic, centralized version of power that was on the rise in the Renaissance. In Vlad's mind, it would be he who controlled Wallachia, not the boyars and not the church. And the only way to keep the throne would be to become as powerful as possible. "You can judge for yourselves," he explained in a letter to the Transylvanian town of Brașov. "When a man or prince is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But
can I just observe something here? When they're pronouncing difficult to pronounce towns and things like that, they always do a really good job of trying to pronounce it the right way and use the right inflection and accents and stuff. But then he calls it Wallachia, which I don't think is at all how that's pronounced. I always thought it was Wallachia, but I could be wrong. Somebody who actually lives in Romania, and I know there are a bunch of you, help me out. Is Wallachia right? Is Wallachia right? I don't know if it's a V or a W sound. Is it pronounced that way? How do you pronounce it there?
But when he is weak, a strong man will come and do what he wants to him." His first act was to purge the boyars of any deemed unfaithful or ambitious, frequently executing them via impalement. Between 1457 and 1461, he replaced all but 2 boyars in his royal council, a body that rarely changed, even as the prince did, suggesting he likely surrounded himself with loyalists. Those loyalists came from a lower strata of the boyar class, while others were mercenaries or followers from his exile in Transylvania. Basically people that owed their elevation directly to Vlad, and who often had no previous ties or allegiances in Wallachia. And the wealth and land that Vlad gave them had, conveniently enough, been provided by their predecessors, who didn't need it anymore. He also instituted a campaign of terror in order to enforce public order. Now, we have to be cautious when discussing this, since first-hand records about his domestic massacres are lacking, and those written by outsiders, based on reports within the country, likely include some exaggeration. But even Romanian oral traditions that are kind to Vlad, casting him as tough but fair, still emphasize his extreme cruelty. Thieves were beheaded, unfaithful wives skinned alive, lazy peasants impaled, Roma people forced into the military or boiled alive. A Romanian folktale tells of how he threw a banquet for beggars, then locked the doors and burned the hall down to stop them burdening the state. And several accounts discuss him impaling priests who did not show him suitable respect.
These are stories that I think there's probably some level of truth to them. I definitely think they're exaggerated to make him look as cruel as possible. But what I found with history is that usually where there's smoke, there's fire. But usually the truth is somewhere in between the extreme version that we're told and the version that's told by the people themselves or by their friends. It's somewhere in the middle usually.
In another story, two diplomats, in some versions representatives of the Ottomans, in others Genoese Italians, once said it was against their custom to remove either their turbans or skullcaps before Vlad. So, he supposedly honored this tradition by having their head coverings nailed to their skulls. And while we can't verify the truth of all these stories, they all share common elements. They portray a ruler who is trying to assert not only his own authority, but who wants to enforce a strict moral code, emphasizing hard work and deference to authority. They also suggest a tendency towards sadism. But the massacres reached a new height when it came to the Transylvanian town of Brașov, which he had wrote to early in his reign, promising his protection if they agreed he could retreat there in the event of being dethroned. Though relations between Vlad and Brașov got rocky fast. See, Brașov was the center of German-Saxon settlement in Transylvania, and a major location for trade and manufacturing.
And he makes an important point there that, you know, when we think of Saxons, a lot of times we think of the Anglo-Saxons who, you know, the Germans who settled in Britain and became the Anglo-Saxons. There was a big Saxon settlement in what is today Romania as well. There's influence there. I mean, they were spreading in both directions. And this is also, if we want to talk about the time period in which this is going on, remember this is right after the sack of Constantinople. This is also right at the beginning of the Wars of the Roses in England. Just to kind of set your mind as far as what else is going on in the rest of the world at this time.
And while it happily sent Vlad artisans, it was also under pressure from Hungary, who by this point realized Vlad was not going to be a Hungarian vassal, to throw their support behind one of Vlad's relatives instead. Two of which, just happened to be hanging around Saxon Transylvania, waiting for their moment. Including Vlad's half-brother, Vlad the Monk. Because again, this series needed more guys named Vlad. Yep. Vlad kept up the dance of diplomacy with the Transylvanian Saxons for a couple of years, ordering them to expel the pretenders, and occasionally carrying out reprisals to make it happen. But by 1459, when the Saxons recognized a third pretender, his patience ran out. He rounded up 41 Brașov merchants living in Wallachia and impaled them. Then he had 300 other Saxons burned alive, claiming that some were spies. Then he led a two-pronged attack into southern Transylvania, burning towns and attacking the outskirts of Brașov before withdrawing. This attack killed thousands and remains one of Vlad's most infamous acts. In retaliation, the Saxons of Brașov threw their full support behind another one of Vlad's relatives, Dan the Pretender, to make a try for the throne. And just from the fact that history remembers this guy as the Pretender, you can probably guess that did not go well. Captured after a brief battle, Dan supposedly knelt while his grave was dug in front of him. All the while, a priest conducting a burial service while the terrified man was still alive. All of which climaxed when an executioner's axe fell, dropping the Pretender's head into an open pit. 3 years into his second reign, Vlad had, through utter brutality, achieved many of his goals. He terrorized the boyars into submission or replaced them, strengthened his power, and created a spectacle of gore. So incredible that both pretenders to the throne and foreign enemies along the border would think twice about trying to unseat the son of the dragon.
Now, we've talked many times before about how it tends to follow that when people go to these extremes, they end up going too far. Of course, you never know at the time what too far is, because it'd be easy to look at Vlad and say he's already gone way too far. It's only in hindsight, as we look back centuries later, that we can see the point at which they went too far. Because at some point, you go from keeping people afraid of you to turning people against you. And where you draw that line, I don't know, because in the process of eliminating your enemies, you're making a whole lot of new ones. So it's hard to say.
And so he turned to foreign policy, the Ottomans. Though Vlad started his reign by paying Mehmed financial tribute, that first payment was the only one he'd sent. And by 1461, he was 3 years past due, and Mehmed was looking for a meeting to clear up the diplomatic frostiness.
Another thing in addition to payments that they would have to often do is supply their young men for the Sultan's army. And that became a point of contention. He'd say, okay, I need 500 more. Okay, I need 1,000 more. And they would have to round up their own young men and send them off to fight in these foreign wars.
The envoys of Mehmed came in force, a Greek diplomat and a Turkish commander at their head. They had planned to capture Vlad, much like Murad had captured Vlad's father. Instead, Vlad's army came out of hiding, surrounding the Turkish force. And upon marching them back to Targovishte, the Ottoman envoys beheld a stake erected for each of them, with 2 higher than the others, one for the Greek diplomat and one for the Turkish commander. Within weeks, Vlad's army was across the Danube River, ravaging Turkish territory, impaling thousands of prisoners, and burning civilians in their homes. Vlad was going to war against the Ottoman Empire, a clash that would prove a reunion. For leading the Turkish army against him was his childhood companion Mehmed, and at the Sultan's right hand, someone even closer to home, Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome. Oh boy.
All right, so let me know your thoughts about all that. Use the comment section below. We will be back with part 4 tomorrow. Thanks for watching.